Morning.
Good morning. How are you all? I'll stand here so everyone can see me. Great. Thank you so much for joining us here at the 2017 Ryga Festival, celebrating George Ryga and creativity and culture here in Summerland and the Okanagan. So before we begin, I'd just like to begin by acknowledging the land on which we are gathering is the unceded territory of the Syilx peoples, where we hope to honor the spirits of those people by considering where we are and how, through the way we live, the work we are doing through our cultural activities and our lives, the impacts and engagements with this space. Thank you. So I'm absolutely thrilled that we find ourselves here today in a circle, having a rich and diverse conversation on the 50th anniversary of the first production of The Ecstasy of Rita Joe by George Ryga, and that we're here in Summerland to be able to have this extraordinary conversation. I'm just going to speak for a moment, and then I'm going to turn over the proceedings to Peter High for a brief moment. Great. So this, for me, was an extraordinary play when I first read it as a very young person. I think I was 11 when I first read the play and found it absolutely explosive in my worldview. So I'm so thrilled that we're here now having this conversation. I'm thrilled as well, and that's not a word I use lightly. I don't use excited or thrilled lightly. I don't use those words in a kind of a woohoo way. That we have this extraordinary group of people, and Peter's going to speak more to that in a moment, so I'll let him do that more. And I'm thrilled and grateful that we're having this conversation in a circle, as a community, so that we can have many voices contribute many perspectives in this space. So there will be, I say this with great generosity, there will be listening. There will be laughter. There may be lively debate. There may be moments when things feel spiky or fractured or scratchy. There may be moments of great love. I welcome all of them into this space. And I think that is inspiration by George Ryga. And so I now thank you. I'm going to have to glide away at a certain point. I look forward to hearing about the event. I have to go and deal with a couple of things that have popped up. And I'm going to pass the proceedings to Peter High. Thank you.
Thank you, Heather. And just a word about the filming here. Gina Heza, who is sitting on Ron's left here, she's from Athabasca and archivist and filmmaker, writer, and she asked whether she could film this, both for its historical record, of course, but also she's making a film about George's early days especially in Athabasca, and so it will be very unobtrusive, but we will have a record of that. Speak a little louder than you might normally, so that we don't have to pass mics around. So that's just a thing. If you have violent objection on being on a film, let Gina know, and it will be taken care of. Anyway, thank you so much again, to reiterate what Heather said, for being here. And it's a very, very important occasion. What I'm seeing here, of course, is a number of familiar faces who knew George Ryga and Norma Ryga, and most of us who got involved in this festival were moved to do so because of that family in this community. And that personal connection is very much part of the whole festival. Almost every single person here is, in the whole festival presentation, has a connection to George Ryga, to Norma, to the family, and to the play that we are discussing today. And that's no coincidence. That's why we are doing the festival, and that's why we're reviving George's presence, not only in Summerland, but in the larger Canadian culture, because so much has been lost in the lost generation. This is a very important year. George would be 85, he would be 85. It's July of this year. He has passed away 30 years ago, coming November. And Rita Joe was performed, I think, in November of '67. I personally arrived in Canada from England and Europe exactly 50 years ago this week. And I was teaching at Simon Fraser University and was wondering where the Canadian plays are that I was not finding, teaching, and somebody told me you should go down to the Playhouse. This was around November, so about 2 months after. And the very first Canadian play that I saw was The Ecstasy of Rita Joe. What a lucky person I am to have done that. And then a couple of years later, I met George, and a year later, I published Ecstasy of Rita Joe, which is still the best-selling Canadian play in history. So this is obviously a movie for me. When it came to the idea of having a discussion, symposium, and discussion about the play, I couldn't think of anyone better to call on to organize this, to lead it, than my old friend Don Rubin. Don has been a critic, an editor, a writer, and a professor at York University, a tireless fighter for Canadian culture. It was always ironic that the Canadian culture fights were being fought critically by Don, who was an exile from the United States, I, who came from Europe at the other end of the country, and occasionally met at various conferences and joined forces. The most important among many, many contributions that Don made was the founding of the Canadian Theatre Review in 1974 at York University, which he edited for many, many, many years. George Ryga was on the original board of advisors, so was I, and Don published many, many essays by George, several plays by him, and at the times when George was fighting the large forces that he was always fighting, he had an advocate, and he was always given that forum which the Canadian Theatre Review provided, and that could not have been possible without many, many sacrifices that Don made. So I'm just really so appreciative that Don came out here with his wife, with his daughter, and on their own expense, and to be here with us and to conduct this discussion, which I'm sure is going to be extraordinary. So over to you, Don.
Thank you, Peter. Peter always has a way of embarrassing me. Peter and I have known each other for close to 50 years now. He is one of the great literary and theatrical provocateurs in this country, and the only person who is a greater literary and theatrical provocateur than Peter was George Ryga. So I'm delighted that Peter was involved in setting this up. And over the last month or two, Peter and I exchanged a number of emails. In one of those emails, I asked Peter why he was doing all of this. Why are you getting involved again? Why is the fight going on again? And Peter was being his provocative self yet once more. And he said to me in one of the emails, which I see on some of the notes here, he told me that in a country whose two largest publicly supported theater festivals were dedicated to the works of dead foreigners, Shakespeare at Stratford and Shaw at Niagara-on-the-Lake, dead foreigners. Perhaps it was time to consider having a festival also devoted to a Canadian playwright. And arguably, the most important Anglophone Canadian playwright who ever lived and worked was George Ryga, a Summerland resident from 1963 to 1987. As Peter said, at the age of 55, we lost him much too early. I certainly wouldn't argue with the appropriateness of that choice of Ryga as the most important Canadian playwright and as the center of a festival that could be national. I was at the Shaw Festival when it first started, and I saw what could happen in a tiny town where people said, there's not enough people, there's not enough interest, it couldn't happen. Go to Niagara-on-the-Lake today and see what can happen in a tiny town. See what can happen for tourism. See what can happen for hotels and restaurants and the arts, incidentally. Today's kickoff event here is really a celebration of that idea of a national playwright and the National Playwrights Festival. Why not a Ryga Fest right here in Rygaland? I think what we're going to do today is kick around that idea, kick around the idea of George Ryga generally, his plays, his works, and specifically the play that everybody knows George Ryga through The Ecstasy of Rita Joe. Today is really a great opportunity to look back at Rita Joe. Peter told us that it was 50 years ago that the play was put on in 1967. It's extraordinary, 50 years later, we're still talking about a play and a writer. There is a test of time, and Ryga and this play have lasted and gone through that test of time. The play has been in print for 50 years. It has never been out of print. It is still studied in high schools and universities across Canada. I have sat on 2 doctoral dissertation defense committees in Europe where Ryga and Rita Joe were the center of the dissertation. There is great interest in Ryga in the rest of the world. In the rest of the world, I note. The play, Rita Joe, and some of George's other work has been done in Europe. These plays have been done in the United States, and these plays have been done in Japan. And I want to tell you that the last production that Pat and I saw of this play was a few years ago in Shanghai, the first Canadian play ever produced in China. And I'm going to pass this around. Here's the program. I hope your Chinese is good. Here is the program. It was part of a festival of world theater in China, the first Canadian play that they were aware of. I have lots to say about Ryga and Rita, but there are other people here who have lots to say, both on the panel and in the room, and I think it's important that we get to everybody. Let me, just before I introduce the panel, say also that I'm very proud that at my university, at York University, there is a George Ryga playwriting bursary which goes to a young Canadian playwright every year. It was established the year George Ryga died, and every year money has been added to it. And every few years when there's a production of The Ecstasy of Rita Joe, all the proceeds from that production go into this bursary. So just be aware of how much Ryga there is all around this country. On the panel with me today are 3 people who have agreed to start off the discussion. There was going to be a 4th, the elder Bev Sellers, She is involved with the fires right now and was unable to come, and we're really sorry that she's not here. But let me introduce the three people who are going to start. To my immediate right, Gina Pesant, an archivist and playwright from Athabasca, Alberta, who is currently preparing a film about George Ryga, and that's the film material around us. Two doors to my left, the celebrated singer Anne Mortefe, who wrote the music for the original Rita Joe. We're absolutely delighted that she has joined us today. And to my immediate left, Victor Davies, whose real claim to fame is that he's the father of the artistic director of the Ryga Festival here, Heather Davies. Incidentally, Victor has had a whole life in the arts and in music, and he is currently working on an opera version of The Ecstasy of Rita Joe, and he'll be speaking about that in a little bit, why Rita Joe, why Ryga. I call this a Ryga Rita rethink, and I'm going to start by asking our three panelists to make some opening statements about their involvement with Ryga and their involvement with Rita Joe. We'll probably have two rounds of the panel. I have a couple of specific questions that may come out of the first round of questions. Then what we'd like to do is open it up to everybody to share you and George Ryga questions, issues, concerns about you, George Ryga, Summerland, the Canadian Theatre, Ryga and First Nations. All is going to be on the table, so please feel free to participate in that. And at some point, if it seems appropriate, we'll take a 5 or 10 minute break so you can catch your breath. There's coffee, tea, and water up here. But if we don't want to take a break, then we'll just keep roaring through. I would like to first ask each of the panelists who or what George Ryga is to them, how the work that they have done or are doing has been affected by this giant of a playwright, and specifically how Rita Joe enters into their involvement with George Ryga. And I'd like to start with Gina Pesant. Gina, you've been literally digging into George Ryga's life and art for your film. You also wrote a play about George Ryga. Could you share with us in 5 or 6 minutes to start your sense of the work and the man?
Mm-hmm. I studied with Tanya at the University of Alberta, and I think the most important lesson I got as a playwright, as a budding playwright at the time, and a theater historian, an archivist, is it's okay to look back a bit. I think today we're going to look back a bit. But one thing George Ryga taught me, you can never look away. That's where I'm coming from. That was the legacy he left me personally, and that's the spirit that I'm approaching the film project, Just a Plowboy, and the play project, An Evening with George Ryga. We can't look away.
Can you say a little bit about the film and what it's going to
Sure.
include?
I'll talk about the film first. The film is called Just a Plowboy. And the title of that came about because, well, for obvious reasons, but it's no secret that he was kind of looked askance at in Athabasca. And I found a 1990 Athabasca Advocate newspaper article where they'd interviewed some of the elderly neighbors that he had in Deep Creek. They're all dead now, so I can speak, I hope, comfortably. And they criticized George Ryga. One said, oh, he was a pacifist. I have my medals. I went to war. If we wouldn't have killed off the Nazis, they would have been the first one they would have taken away, which could be true. Another one said, well, he never came to visit us. He lost interest in us, which I don't think that's true either. the last comment was, well, he didn't come and visit us, so why should we listen to him? He was just a plowboy like us. And I read that, and it just seemed true. It was simple, it was true. So we've taken a look at, well, I'll tell you about the film. The first half of it, we've interviewed Margot Kane. She was gracious. We had the better part of a day with her. She talked a lot, we listened a lot, and she talked about...
Margot Kane was the first First Nations person to play the role of Rita Joe.
Prairie Theatre Exchange was an all Indigenous cast, and she was Rita Joe. So she talked about that. But importantly, she talked about how being Rita Joe and importantly, her friendship with George Ryga caused her to develop so many other programs involving Indigenous youth. And today she's artistic director at Full Circle Theatre in Vancouver. So she talked about the role of her, the friendship she had with George Ryga and how that supported her so much, helped give her career direction and shape. And she talked about how the play helped give a voice. The play that I'm writing is coming, I guess I'm come by being a playwright before I'm a screenwriter, easier. It's called An Evening with George Ryga, and it's my gift to the citizens of Athabasca. It's a theater event, I guess, in 12 scenes. And I use as a through line George Ryga's essay, Notes from a Silent Boyhood, which was published in Wild Strawberries and Clover by Georgia Preshko exactly 50 years ago, 1967. It is a play that focuses on Ryga's early years, but it certainly gets into Captives of a Faceless Drummer and that situation. So working on the play and the film at the same time, which I know sounds a bit crazy, but one's feeding off of the other, and at this point in time it's making sense. Most importantly, what I have to say that in my heart is the most important thing to say right now, I'm just so grateful to be here, and I'm looking forward to hearing and doing a lot of listening, because I'm a relative newcomer to this Summerland world of George Ryga. I know him through my studies, and I know him through Tanya. I know him through my reading, but I'd like to get to know him also through you. So thank you for the opportunity to be here.
Thank you, Gina. I wonder if we turn to Anne Mortefi, who actually was very involved with creating with George Ryga, working with Ryga himself. The play, as I'm sure all of you know, was written for Canada's centennial year to celebrate Canada's glorious past. Money came from the federal government. Money came from Canada to celebrate Canada's glorious past in 1967. The fact that Canada didn't have such a glorious past in relation certainly to its First Nations people, the fact that Ryga was the first dramatist in Canada to dare to suggest that racism was part of Canada's glorious history meant that the play would upset many people, meant that the play would break new ground thematically. Canadian plays prior to Ryga were pretty gentle, were pretty bland, never dealt with really serious issues in any serious way. And Ryga also broke ground dramaturgically, creating a play with music, a kind of Brechtian, kaleidoscopic anatomization of everything that was wrong with Canada. And the Canadian government was not immediately amused by the use of its money this way. But everybody who has ever been involved with that original production, and Anne Mortefi was at the center of that, has talked about what an extraordinary experience it was creating that play. It was explosive. I've read all sorts of pieces by people involved who said it was nasty and it was difficult and people kept losing faith. And could I ask you if you could share some of those experiences of George Ryga? What was in your head as you started to work on this Brechtian play, this play with music? Can you speak a little bit about that original production and what it meant to you?
Oh, boy.
And you have 30 seconds.
Thank you. I was very young, and I'd actually never gone to a theater piece. I knew nothing. And I was working, singing. I'd just fallen in love with singing and music, and I was picking up my guitar at a little clubhouse where I'd been singing the night before, and he said, "Oh, you're going to the audition?" And I said, "What's an audition?" And he said, "Oh, there's a play at the Playhouse. Come down. They're looking for a girl singer." So I went down, and I said, "What do I do?" He says, "Sing that song I like about da-da-da-da." So I did, and I got the job. And I was brought into a world that was so familiar to me, although I'd never been in one like it. And I was brought up in South Africa, and I'd lived on a sugarcane farm in Zululand during the apartheid era. So I was very conscious about what was going on in South Africa. I didn't know that apartheid had been built on the Indian Act. I didn't know that what I had experienced as a girl was happening in the new country that I'd come to. And I was so profoundly moved by it. And I fell in love with George and all the people that were there very easily.
There were two Georges. George Bloomfield was the director,
yeah.
and George Ryga the
right.
writer. So
That's
did
right.
you fall in love with both of them?
No, George Ryga. But what was so great for me was I had the experience of what art can do for culture. Half the company was white, Caucasian, half was native. And just this morning, when Richard Armstrong was talking about, he's the knowledge keeper for the She-Ilks Nation. And I remember George talking about spending time with the nation and getting a lot of information from them. But I'd never heard so clearly how deeply he had gone into it until this morning. And I think it really validates the understanding of the feeling between the two cultures and how he, the things that he wrote, the way he expressed story, the way Chief Dan, who had a huge impact on my life also, it was the first time that I really felt at home in Canada. I felt that I was, I up till then had felt somehow paralyzed to be able to do anything. I just was singing songs, which I loved to do, but I was looking for what could I do with my life. Singing a song just didn't have the juice for what I felt inside until I did The Ecstasy of Rita Joe. And working with Chief Dan and hearing the way he used story to move the heart from here to there without ever addressing the actual situation. The story itself showed the experience, evoked the experience. And I think that's what caused me to fall in love with story on a really visceral level. And never had I seen it as a story. My nanny in Africa, Gosololo, she told me stories. And those stories, they bypassed the logical mind and entered the heart and drew you to a new awareness. And that's what George had the capacity to do in this play. the way he went from the harshness of what Rita Joe was going through in the courthouse to the open-hearted love that she was experiencing from her grandfather, and the story of his grief, and the last sentence after she'd been raped and murdered, when he stood alone. Oh, I'm getting weepy.
Okay.
When he stood alone at the end of the play and said, when Rita Joe first came to the city, she told me the cement made her feet hurt. I mean, it was so powerful. There wasn't a person in the audience who wasn't in tears. It was so extraordinary. And what that has done for my life, it set me on a projectile which has taken me in and out of music to other cultures, to travel. You know, I could tell when my music became not true. I could feel it in my bones that George would say, "Stop it, Anne. Stop it." You know? I remember when I was in New York and I was offered the lead role in a musical by the name of Promises, Promises, and before I had signed my contract, I was working with the musical director and I was singing, "What do you get when you fall in love? You get enough germs to catch pneumonia, and after you do, he'll never phone ya." And I went, what if I died singing this song? Literally, what if I died singing this song? And I was immediately back with Rita Joe. And I said, I cannot do this. And my agent said, "Anne, you've got to do it. I mean, after that you can choose anything you want. You'll be a superstar. Do it, do it." And I said, I can't do it. I just can't do it. I knew I would probably die in a 3-year contract, 8 shows a week. I knew I was going to die. Writing the ballet for The Ecstasy of Rita Joe, I remember Arnold Spohr, who was the artistic director, called me and asked if I would do it. I said, I've never written a song except what I wrote for Rita Joe, because the chap who had been hired to write the music sometimes wasn't there or hadn't got it done. And so they'd say, George would say to me, "Anne, just make up anything. Like just play the guitar and make up anything so we have something to do during the rehearsal." I'd go, "Okay, George." You know, he was very formidable. He was very formidable. You didn't question George. At least at that age I didn't. And so I would make something up, and then they took to recording it and giving me the tape and the tape recorder and saying, "Go home and learn this." And that is how I became a composer. I had never had the confidence to think that I could write music. So when Arnold Spohr called me from the Winnipeg Ballet, I said, "I've never even seen a ballet." I mean, I come from a farm in Zululand. And he said, "Well," I said, "I really don't think I can do this. It's
That's
too
the
much
program
for me."
around.
I
Yes, we
know.
do.
And I said, he said, "Anne, I saw the play. Tell me, do you love Rita Joe?" And I said, "Absolutely." And he said, "Do you know how she feels?" I said, "How could I possibly know the depth of feeling she carries? But I feel in my heart who she is, and I love her." And he said, "You bring your heart to Winnipeg, and we'll see what happens." And so I was thrown into my life as an artist by working with George. And I used to come up here often in the summer and sleep in the house that still people are sleeping in. And knew you when you were young too, and George and I would walk up in the hills and sit, and he would have written poems and I'd write songs, and I became an artist through that. I fell in love with a possibility of what the arts can do for culture, for us as human beings. And so here we are today, 50 years later, which I can't believe. And it's as real today as it was then. And that's what really good art should do, and that's what George left us with, something that unfortunately is as relevant today as it was then. And that's why I'm so glad you're going to be doing this opera.
Great segue. David, will you talk to us about why you're doing an opera version of Rita Joe? What is it about Ryga and Rita Joe that's caught you?
It's hard to follow.
Yeah.
Well, I'm just a boy from Winnipeg. My association with the play, I never saw the play until they did a read at Luminato, this big art festival in Toronto. They had I guess an indigenous component of it, and they did Kevin Loring's play with the Blood Mixes, and they did a production of that. They did a reading of Rita Joe. Margot Kane was Rita Joe, and Kevin Loring actually was Jamie Paul, and so that was the first time I saw it live. Prior to that, John Giuliani, who I had a long relationship, I did many radio shows for him, and his first movie in Edmonton, where's Donna? There she is, Latitude 55. Our common link was Augie Schellenberg,
Yeah.
who was married to Joe Karasevich, who was an actress and singer who I went to university with. And I met Augie when she was doing a show in Winnipeg before we moved to Toronto. So Augie was my link to the play, kind of a living link to the play. And both he and John kept saying to me over the years, Victor, you have to write an opera based on Rita Joe. And I said, well, I don't know. I'll give you the script. Okay, I read it. And I don't know. And then later, I can't remember the exact order of things that happened, but in 1991, John commissioned a radio adaptation from Michael Cook, and it was produced for the CBC, and John got me to write the music, and I said, well, aren't you using Anne Morgan's music? Well, no, we're not doing songs really as the way they were done in the play, and we have a whole bunch of scoring. And I said, oh, okay, I'll do it. So then, there were some songs, but they weren't sung by a folk singer. They were sung by Jamie Paul and Rita Joe. And I had to kind of twist my mind up a bit about how from the script they were transformed into this manifestation in the radio play. So then, I don't know what happened next, but I think I began to, it kind of stew around my mind, and I talked to Donna, and I said, well, Donna, I said, look, I think I might be interested in writing an opera, but how am I going to get the rights? Because when I did the radio show, George was alive, and he was this mystical figure somewhere, and I thought he must be very distant and probably unapproachable for me, little Victor from Winnipeg. How would he ever let me write an opera of this? And so I said to Donna, do you think I could get the rights to do this? And she said, well, I'll talk to Tanya. And I think that was after George had died, yeah. So I never had the pleasure of meeting him or sitting with him or talking to him or anything else. It was only through this play and other things that I subsequently read, particularly in Night Desk and other plays and things he's written, that I became acquainted with this great spirit and this great talent. So anyway, Donna said, yes, get a hold of Tanya. She says that would be possible for you to get the rights. So then I was calling Augie up and I was saying, so Augie, what happened in the rehearsal here? Oh yeah, that. Then he would talk about it, the progress of the composition of the play and what happened with the actors, So I kept phoning him constantly because I had no other kind of touchstone of somebody who'd been in the room. I should have called you. But because he had been Jenny Paul, I thought he could really be really helpful. He was to some extent. Then I thought, okay, what am I going to do? I got the rights to this to the opera. What am I going to do? So I had done an opera for Manitoba Opera in 2007, based on Maureen Hunter's Transit of Venus. And so I went to Larry and I said, look, what about doing an opera of Rita Joe? I'll be very candid here. That's an old play. Nobody cares about it. And I said, Larry, no, there's an opera in there. And he said, okay, well, let's go to talk to Rebecca Chartrand, who we had worked with in Pan Am Games, 1999. She and another Indigenous singer, I think she's Ojibwe, from Winnipeg, and Lawrence Happy Laughing, who's from Akwesasne. He was working in Winnipeg as an alcohol and rehabilitation counselor. These are the two people that they gave to us as the Indigenous connection for the Pan Am Games. Well, in 1967, to bring the flame to Winnipeg for the Pan Am Games, they had 6 Indigenous runners who ran it from Minneapolis to Winnipeg, but they were not allowed to run it into the stadium. And so we wanted to right that wrong. And so 5 of them were still alive. So we had these huge York boats that were built that were used on the Red River for transportation. And they came in with these huge 5 York boats, and they had the flame. They passed it back and forth with one another. And then for the lead boat, they gave it to 2 young Indigenous runners who ran it all the way up the stairs and lit the cauldron. And so I worked with Rebecca, and she and Happy sang me dozens and dozens of songs. And I said to Happy, what about, He says, that's not really Aboriginal music. He says, that's the red man mourning for the loss of their land to the white man. We're going to sing these real Indigenous songs, real Aboriginal songs. So they sang me song after song, songs I could actually write down, just as if I was writing down Yesterdays by the Beatles. Oh, song after song after song. So we worked together, and I actually talked to one of the chief, David Perchain, during the process about permission to use one of the songs. So we went to see Rebecca, and I was quite nervous about seeing her, and I said, look, I didn't have the rights right at that moment. We were just sort of kind of, I said, I'm telling you something very secret, you can't talk about it with anybody else. Okay, I want to do an opera of the Ecstasy of Rita Joe. You have to do it. That was like that. That was it. You have to do it. Well, why? She says, well, one of the main topics of that play is about the murdered women, and this is such an important topic now. This is, you just have to do it. That's all there is to it. You have to do it, Victor. There's no question about it. Well, we talked about it for about 2 hours with Larry, and then he thought, oh, well, maybe this is a very important thing to do. As a matter of fact, this is a little side note. We came out of the meeting, and he said, it was in the Larry DeRoche, and he said, he was so pumped up after this meeting. He said, he said, I think I might be Métis. And I said, before he wasn't interested in this play at all. Now he's a Métis. He guys, he figures I'll have a connection to the community. So anyway, he says, I had an uncle, Izzy. You see it coming. And Israel is a very common Métis name. So anyway, 2 weeks later, I went back to Toronto, I phoned him, and I said, so Larry, are you Métis? You talked to your mother and your uncle? He says, no, he says, actually, I think I might be Jewish. so anyway, we never followed that track again. Anyway, so I got the play, and I started to think, well, how am I going to adapt this into an opera? There's lots of words, and there's lots of wonderful words, and great characters, and fantastic scenes. So Larry was my dramaturge, just as he was for Maureen. I wrote the libretto, because I thought, well, I had adapted the Book of Revelation, and there was an admonition at the end of the Book of Revelation, woe betide he who changes a word. In other words, like the lightning's gonna come and strike you. I figured, and I was flying over Winnipeg, and there was a thing about the 144,000 people that were the saviors and everything. And as I flew over Winnipeg to Vancouver, I think maybe due to the music of Rita Joe, I took my pencil and cut that in the Book of Revelation. So I figured, I think I could take on the ecstasy of Rita Joe. So I started working on it, thinking about how the main problem of writing, well, to write an opera, as far as I was concerned, where was the story? Where was the skeleton of the story that you could hang the music on in terms of the great moments of great lyrical singing? And the libretto, I think, went, well, I stopped, I numbered them draft 3A, number 2. So I think there were about 32 drafts, I guess, if you counted all my A's and B's and the decimal points. So we arrived at a version that Larry thought was very good and it would work. And we had a workshop of the opera of a little company that is going to do a concert version of it next March. God willing, the music's finished. And then Heather actually dramaturged. I asked for singers to read it, not actors, because actors always assume that what they're reading is the final product. I wanted people, because the singers kept saying, "What is the music like in this scene?" And I had no idea. I said, but you had a sense, they had an awareness that they were only engaging with a part of the actual finished thing. So now Tanya is going to be hearing things that she's never heard before, and so there are characters. Some characters disappeared, but one of the things which is different in the play, the libretto, the opera, has a couple of big dramatic points. In the end, Rita Joe and Jamie Paul both die in the end, and only Rita Joe dies in the end. Jamie Paul is there, and he is very, very badly beaten up. He does not die in the end, and also in the opera, at this point, Rita Joe is pregnant. She's going to have a baby. You don't see anything. You don't see that she's going to have a baby because it takes place in a certain period of time. We don't really see that. That was Larry's kind of suggestion. What we were trying to say, okay, what could the stakes be raised in this relationship? And he suggested, well, what if she was pregnant? And I said, wow. Well, that in the end, when she dies, when the murderers come at the last scene, Jamie Paul tries to, one of the things he says to try and protect her, she's going to have a baby, and they say to him, we don't care. She's going to come and work for us on the street, and that's it. It's interesting. Heather had a friend who was an RCMP, OPP officer, a woman, and I asked her, because Larry said in the dramaturgical thing, well, these guys can't come and just kidnap her. And I said, well, I think that's exactly what they do. And I phoned the OPP officer and I said, at the very end of the play, there's a scene where the murderers come and they come to kidnap her to take her to put her back on the street. And they in the play they kill both of them. They kill both of them, her by accident and him just to get rid of her. She said that wouldn't happen in real life. What would happen in real life is the guys would come and they want to grab the woman. They couldn't care anything about the guy. They couldn't even bother to kill the guy. They just get out, and there's 4 or 5 of them. Well, and he says, what happens, all the things I've seen, is the woman is taken away, the guy is left there, and the woman he's taken away, he loves is taken away, and he just starts to drink, and eventually he just dies. Just dies. He said, that's the scenario that I've seen over and over again. So I said, okay, so the kidnapping is plausible. It is absolutely, she said. So she's not kidnapped, she's raped, and she dies in the course of rape, as we know in the play. So those are the kind of a couple of big dramatic things. The other thing that I've done is I've kind of straightened out the chronology of the story. The chronology of the story in the opera is it all happens in sort of through time. There's The first act is very expressionistic, going back and forth in time. And my opinion as a composer was that it's very hard for the audience to understand the dramatic progression and the thematic progression of the music. You know, you have a theme for a character, you bring it here, you develop it, you associate with the character later on. It has a tremendous resonance whenever you hear that recapitulation of the music. Something so primordial and what it says to the audience about who the character is and what they've experienced previously in the story. So this was a very big job to do it. But I think actually what was interesting was Donna, very familiar with the play, said to me, I sent her a draft about 6 drafts ago with this straightened out story. She said, "It's exactly like the play." And I said, well, no, it's not exactly like the play. The story is what's in the play. The characters are all there. The school teacher is not there. And there was lots of very wonderful scenes with J.D. Paul, the stories he tells. But J.D. Paul is there, large as life, the trickster character. Rita Jo is there. And the other thing in the opera, which is slightly changed, is that I felt in the play. Now, I didn't see that. I did not see the original play. I only saw Franny Highland once on the stage, and that was a production, very famous production I did of, good,
That one.
Mother Courage. And Franny played the mute at Mother Courage. And every night when she was on the roof of the Mother Courage, when she got shot and killed, I was pretty stalwart all during the play, but every night when she got shot, I lost it. I was already could play the music to finish off the play. She was such a powerful actress. And I think that was one of the qualities in the original production, that Franny had a presence.
She did.
And I did not see the production, so I was not aware of what the dimension she could bring to it. And I wondered whether there was actually an opera singer who had the dramatic power to be able to deliver that character in that way that she could. So in the libretto, Rita Jo, all the things, there are a couple of fantasies, because Tanya asked me, well, how much original materials are going to be? And I said, well, I don't know. I don't think very much. And I think there might be like actual words by Victor Davies, 10%. The rest is editing, readjusting, and everything else. There's two kind of song moments for me. The rest is George's words. And one of the things that I keep saying to people, when I started working on the words, I thought, oh, this is really hard stuff. Because when I had to read a line, it was basically, although it was prose, if you tried to inject a word into that line, it just felt like you were doing some terrible injustice, you know? You'd had to get rid of the line, you'd had to figure out a way to massage it so that it all fitted together in some kind of way, but you could maybe cut it some way, but if you tried to put a line into the middle of the line, it was death.
Yeah.
Ryga was a poet, and
He was
that's
a poet.
what you're talking about is the difficulty of changing a poet's lines, and that's a very real issue. Before you give it all away, I just really have
My
one
time is
last
up.
short question. When are we going to see it? That's all.
You're going to see it. Okay, you're going to see it in Toronto in a concert version at the end of March next year. And then we're supposed to see the whole production in 2019 in Winnipeg, fully staged with orchestra and everything else. And we're having a meeting. We're hoping that Vancouver will also pick up the production. We're going to see Kim Gaynor in Vancouver next week. She's interested in a possibility in Larry's production, and she knows the play very well. So we didn't have to do any persuading there in terms of that. And I have to say, we have four wonderful Indigenous singers, opera singers. They're opera singers.
Wonderful.
I said in my first preface, in the very first draft, it's unlikely we'll have Indigenous singers. Where are they? But during the course of time, Mary Newman, who's actually from Mirsuk, is Rita Jo, and she's a wonderful singer, and we followed her around for years. Well, she's a great dramatic singer. Could she do all the crazy things? You know, she got the great sense of humor. And we then saw, oh, she do that. That's actually the
We
marionette.
are going to buy our tickets as soon as we finish this panel.
Okay.
You've sold us. Absolutely.
Now-
And it's gonna be here at the festival, and you have to get your daughter to book it here somehow.
Oh, it's a-
That's the next challenge.
it's a
Let
massive-
me just move on a bit.
Yeah,
I know there's a lot of
I
people
could
who
talk for
want
hours.
to,
Thank
there's a
you,
lot of
Rob.
people who want to
Thank
say
you for your
things.
indulgence.
What I'd like to do is move the discussion forward a little bit, and just point out to people that the fact is that by about 1970, Ryga had written this play in 67, it was done then. Next play, Grass and Wild Strawberries, bigger. Ryga was selling out every theater, wherever the show was done. Rita Joe was then restaged and brought to the National Arts Center for the opening of the National Arts Center. Rita Joe was huge then. The only comparison I could sort of make today of how big George Ryga was back then was that he was as big as Margaret Atwood is today. Margaret Atwood could sell her laundry list today and make money on it. I think George could have done that at that time. Up to about the early 70s, then George started running into various problems because he was moving into very difficult political areas of social justice. As he once said in an essay he wrote for me for the Canadian Theatre Review, he said, "Because I refuse to divorce theatre from the larger issues of life confronting us, I get punished. My plays are produced less frequently today. Words written by me have been bastardized and rearranged beyond recognition. The cause of a viable Canadian theatre has reeled under the counterattack of a social and political system that viciously defends itself against all criticism and examination. I've been hurt. And because I've been hurt, so have you. Because I, as a writer, do no more than reflect your experiences, your thoughts, your possibilities through my art. The role of theater, as I see it, is to give light, color, and nobility to the quality of our lives." I would like to move on in some of this discussion past some of that difficult time in Ryga's life and maybe look at Rita Joe today. Today we have moved forward to the point there are many First Nations writers, important First Nation writers. There are a number of anthologies of First Nations plays. The Governor General's Award has gone to First Nation writers like Thompson Highway. Other writers today whose works are being done a lot, Daniel David Moses, Monique Mojica, many others. It was George Ryga who I think began the dialogue, and I think Peter said this, that fostered the current atmosphere of reconciliation and recovery of historical truth on Canadian stages. Ryga did that back in the 60s. Ryga was far ahead of his time. I suggest that Ryga, if he were still with us, would probably be leaving most of that material to Indigenous writers to take forward, and he would be moving into other areas that need a voice, that require his conscience, his confrontation with social issues. He was decades ahead of most writers in terms of perceptions back then, and I suggest to you that he would be decades ahead today. If issues were not being articulated by specific communities today, I have no doubt that he would still be unafraid to take those on. Like Walt Whitman, he was large and his subjects were large. He criticized and he fought against Canada's colonial mentality. and I'm quoting Peter on some of these things, and those who poison our environment, governments, and corporations that exploit the poor and disenfranchised, schools that do not teach their young their own national history. That is part of the lesson, and it's a big lesson that Ryga left for the arts in Canada, that Ryga taught all of our artists, and that's why I think his example must never be forgotten. Ryga would have moved on, but what George Ryga did and said as part of his own personal history, I think must be remembered. And what I'd like to do for this quick second round before we open it up to everybody is to just talk about the elephant in the room, if I might. Did George Ryga appropriate the voice of this country's poor and disenfranchised? Did George Ryga appropriate the voices of our First Nations? Or did he enable these voices? How do we recognize his contributions in this area? What is the right thing to do today vis-a-vis George Ryga? And I wonder if I can just have a quick comment from everybody here, and then let's open it to anything you want to talk about.
Thank you.
Gina.
Yeah, I'd like to address that very much. But first, I would like to say that everything I say in this passage about to come is to the memory of Ruth Cox. And you will learn in a moment who Ruth Cox was. My job as an archivist is to preserve records. And my job as a playwright is to engage and challenge. In our archives in Athabasca, George Ryga grew up just north of Athabasca in a community inside of Richmond Park called Deep Creek. In our archives in Athabasca, the same story is told over and over. First, we see it in David Gregory's Athabasca Ryga, page 125 to be precise, an unfinished, unpublished story fragment, undated, by George Ryga, probably written in the mid-1950s. In the story, George Ryga's Stony Creek is a thinly disguised Athabasca. The story is about a young Indigenous woman who is killed as she takes a walk, quote, to exercise away a numbing headache which had persisted for most of her workday at the bank, end of quote. Much later, about a decade ago, a young man hits and kills an Indigenous woman on a highway a few kilometers from my house. I know the people involved. The mother comes to my classroom in the morning after this woman is killed. And she says, Gina, lock the door. I have to talk. And she reveals to me that her son didn't know what to do, so he came home. And they said, son, you have to phone the police. Her eldest son wanted to comfort the younger son. And he said, it's okay, brother. It's just another wagon burner. My friend said, where did that come from? This is my son. Who taught him that? Did I teach him that? She was as upset at what her son said as she was about the death of this woman. There was no police investigation. About 4 years ago, a disabled young Native woman, her body was found a few miles upstream, Athabasca River. She had trouble walking. How did she get there? We don't know. Somebody out there knows. We don't know. There was no police investigation. As an archivist, I have the records to prove these things, and Ryga's Ecstasy of Rita Jo stands to testify Ryga's reaction to the stories of these Indigenous women. Then, And now. So I ask then, if a story is told, and in this case it's lived too, over and over again, does it become us? Does it get intrinsically woven into the fabric of our national identity? How do we move ahead with this process of nation building in this, our 150th year? As an archivist, I know that Rita Joe's story is told too many times, then and now and still and yet. So, how do we give the story a better ending? Yes, it involves an Indigenous woman, but it also involves non-Indigenous people. It is our story too. Can we give the story a better ending? Maybe we can't. The records have been written or spoken, as the case might have it. We can't uninvent the past. But as a nation, as citizens, we can create new stories. And how do we do this? We encourage dialogue, meaningful dialogue, like we do here, like we do today. This is all a part of the necessary process that we must engage on, whether we get the grant or not. We do it. We put on the coffee. That's all it takes. We talk. We talk among ourselves. We do whatever it takes to talk, meaningful dialogue, and we do it unfailingly. Meaningful dialogue means listening as much as talking. As a non-Indigenous woman, I know I have a tendency to talk too much. And now is our listening time. I talked with Margot Kane for the better part of a day, and we talked about listening and what it means. We talked about the relinquishing of the power that we have come so accustomed to having. And we talked about inviting people to the table and making it clear that their contributions, their visions, their dreams, their ideas will shape the agenda as much as ours. In fact, maybe it's time that we give up a little bit of our concepts of how things should go when we invite Indigenous people to the table. Let them shape things for a while. We've done enough. Let's sit back. Let's encourage them to get the grant money. Let's put them in power for a change. We can sit back. It's going to be hard. Hey, you know what? They might even make a mess on our lawn. But that's something that's a part of the process. Meaningful dialogue means listening as much as talking. I've already said that. Besides listening, darn well, I think it's time to share and even relinquish our power. I think we've called the shots long enough. As archivist, I preserve records. As playwright, I try to engage and challenge. As George taught us, oh yes, he engaged, and oh yes, he challenged, still does. Sometimes as a playwright, I use the archives I find in my archives, and in other people's archives too. Hence my film, Just a Plowboy, and my play, An Evening with George Ryga. I'm just going to make a brief aside here. We were talking about adaptations of using George Ryga's work. I spent years trying to do an adaptation of Ballad of a Stone Picker, which we all know is a thinly disguised autobiography of George Ryga's life in Richmond Park. And Tanya will tell you I struggled and struggled and struggled and struggled because every word is there for a George Ryga reason. Whether you like that reason or not, that doesn't matter. And then there it needs to stay, I believe. So I'm doing a film instead. Other people's words. I want the story to change, okay? The current story or the path, call it what you will. Rita Joe's destiny is just simply not acceptable. Perhaps its telling has not run its course, though, quite yet. For change to happen, we must look at the truth. And if the truth is not so apparent, then we must seek it out. Thank you.
Let me turn to Ann Mortefi. Is Rita Joe our story still? Is it time for us to be quiet? And if it is, what does that mean for the production of George Ryga plays? What does it mean for the ecstasy of Rita Joe? What is your sense of that?
Well, the story goes on, that's for sure. We wouldn't be going through what we're going through with the missing women and the heartbreak around that whole thing. And I must say that Trudeau has really stepped up to try and change things by looking at taking down the India Act and so forth. I mean, so I think I see hope in that. The question of appropriation, talking about other people's problems, I think, for me, I wrote the music for Rita Joe without even barely a glance towards the native music, mainly because I didn't know how to do anything but my own work. You know, I didn't have, it wasn't that I didn't have listening, because I'd been in sweat lodges and I'd done all of that. It felt to try and copy would be, well, I couldn't do it. I only know how to write what comes out of me. So it's been difficult. And you know, when I wrote the music for When the Rains Come, the music I did as an anti-apartheid thing for a musical that played. I think the main thing it showed me doing that is that I took the passion I felt for my childhood, for Bosololo, for what the people of Africa went through, as George took his passion for what it was happening with the indigenous people here. And I allowed myself to follow that. Now, I didn't go and try and change the music to be African. I let what was in me of Africa speak. And what I discovered was that what I think Rita Joe has done, when I wrote that music for When the Rains Come, I remember the day I was writing the song where the white woman and black man got together, and they'd grown up together under the site of a Zulu Sangoma, which is a shaman. And when they were much older, they found each other again and realized they'd always loved each other, that they were destined to work for the end of apartheid together. And this was all George. It's all his, he taught me I could do this. I could go for it in this way. I was in my studio writing the song where, because of the Immorality Act in South Africa, which came from here, if a man and woman of two races were found together, they were in prison, and it usually meant death to the black person. And so they realized that if they continued to see each other, they were endangering what was happening in South Africa, and they were devoted to the freeing of South Africa. So I was in my studio writing the song where they're in prison, and Emily says, "I will not take my freedom until Kenyele is free." And someone came into my studio and said, "Oh my God, we just heard," and I had Nelson Mandela and Stephen Biko on my piano. We've just heard they're dismantling, that they let Nelson out of jail. It was pouring rain. I ran out onto my porch and I yelled, "Nelson, you're welcome!" Because I had this little feeling that my passion was like a speck of sawdust that tipped the scales. It wasn't the defining one, but it made an impact because that moment in history had come. And I had offered my little weeny speck to it. Then we're at the Arts Club Theatre. I've just sung through the whole thing with Ed, my buddy, Ed Henderson. And we were all in tears when at the end, when the rains came, and somebody runs up the stairs into the rehearsal hall and says, we just heard on the CBC, they're dismantling apartheid. I said, you're kidding, and we all cheered and cried and hugged each other and so forth. And then, months later, we're standing in the wings to go on for the first production, opening night, and they're lining up in South Africa for the first free election. And my work was magnificently obsolete.
Wow.
The day it opened.
Wow.
But what that showed me is what I had actually learned from George, which was that the work of an artist is to be true to themselves, to speak the truth as they see it and know it, to go to the depth of their disappointment and sorrow and joy and love and anger and all of those things, to go to the depth of it, to speak about it, and that it doesn't matter if your production is done when you're alive or when you're dead. What matters is that the work of an artist is to be true and to dream so deeply that their passion vibrates, you know, the vibrating matrix that connects us all. And when you do that, I felt that when the rains come was showing me that it's our dreaming that makes a difference, because the pieces
Wow.
never been really seen. But the other thing was that when we were in Australia with the ballet, there's a photo somewhere, and I can't find it, but they would have it at the RW. There's a photo of Rita Joe bowing, and the whole of this huge room is filled with roses being thrown down onto the stage because it spoke to what was happening with the Australian Aboriginal people. It talks about what our colonial world has done. Now, I'm a product of the colonial. My parents were plantation owners. So I went back to Africa to make a gesture on behalf of my family. So appropriation, what does that mean, really? I mean, I understand it intellectually, and I understand it with my heart. You need, there has to be space for the Aboriginal to speak their truth into us, because we do need it. There's no question. It is, the whole fabric of culture, global culture, is disseminating because we've dropped those stitches. In fact, we've ripped those stitches out. We have to find them again. But if I feel, as an artist, I spoke the truth for myself. And life went to a lot of trouble to make the dates perfect, so that I would get it. It doesn't matter if nobody sees it. Dream on, girl. So I don't know what appropriation really means, because we're coming into a time when, and I think George understood this, where we speak for each other when something needs to be said in our own way. We're not stealing from anybody. I understand about sacred songs, that you should not sing a sacred song of someone else's without permission. That I get, totally. But I feel that we're coming into this place where we need what everybody has to say so deeply that I probably have appropriated 1,000 things. I don't know how not to. I'm just drinking it in all the time, from different cultures all over the world, in fact, different religions. Just let it change me, let it broaden me, let it open me. So George understood that, and he didn't worry about it too much. He just went for it with his own fire. And I know some of that fire comes into me, and I can almost feel him in the room, you know, just that fiery, you know, he gets so furious thinking about certain things. I love that fury. And certainly with Rita Joe, not long ago, I was called by a Native person saying, would you be willing for us to redo the music for Rita Joe? Because we feel it doesn't represent us. I said, absolutely. You know, nothing belongs to us. I learned that from Rita Joe.
That's lovely. Victor, are you going to hear about appropriation of voice in your opera, do you think?
I don't know. You know, when I started this process, I thought, well, is there an indigenous writer that I can work with? And I met Kevin Loring a number of times, and so the kind of meeting we met at the Toronto airport. He was on his way to the National Orchestra because he was the artist in residence there, and I talked to him about working on the libretto, and so anyway, he said to me at this meeting at the airport, you know, I'm really, really busy at the National Arts Center, and he said, you know, really to do an opera artist, we're going to have to tear the whole thing apart and rebuild it. And I was like, oh, whoa, I don't want to hear about that. Anyway, this is more or less what I have done to arrive at a way to bring the story. I mean, Donna said it's exactly the same as the play, but I have had to do an awful lot of work to mold it into an opera libretto. But the other thing he said to me, he says, you know, I'm going to Ottawa tomorrow and I have to go to speak at this meeting. And I said, yeah, I asked him why you sound really unhappy about it. He said, well, he says, the reason I'm really unhappy about it is the first thing they're going to ask me is, what do you think about cultural appropriation? And he says, I think that is the stupidest topic that I can imagine. And I don't want to know about it because we're all appropriating all the time. And I did a lot of thinking about getting together. And now I'm reading a lot of indigenous writers and history. And there's a wonderful book by Thomas Kane called The Inconvenient Indian.
Yes.
And it's an absolutely eye-opening book. He's originally, I think, Navajo, but he as just, I think he still teaches English at the University of Guelph. But anyway, I started to think about appropriation. Well, Marion Newman, who is our Rita Joe, and Larry will be in Winnipeg too. She did a wonderful recital at the Canadian Opera. They have a space that they have free new hour concerts, and she did a song with a title like song program. Oh, Song of Appropriation, and it starts and it is to the tune of Three Little Indians, and she says, Jenny Brown from the tribe of blah 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 became an orthodontist, and she goes on like this, and it's obvious that in her song she's saying, yeah, well, all these indigenous people appropriated all this mainline culture. They, you know, and it was supposed to be very ironic, and she never sung it publicly before. She was quite embarrassed about singing it. And it was, that's what it was. So I was thinking, okay, the horse, appropriation, rifles, appropriation, beads, appropriation. Better to work with than porcupine quills, you know?
Mm-hmm.
So it works both those ways. Cultures have always appropriated from one another. Will I have problems? I don't know. It's interesting. Rebecca refers to Larry and I as allies in the cause. You know, she says, because I kept phoning her and saying, I don't know about doing this. People are going to be shooting in my direction. She says, no, you have to do it. Because you're speaking, the play is a well-worn play. It's done, it's read in the Manitoba schools. Everybody knows it. It's a powerful story. But working on it, I think it's more than just a Canadian story. Mm-hmm. I think it is a powerfully universal story.
Yes, it is.
Because the Rita Joe, when she is arrested for prostitution, and when the guy, I mean, that scene, when the guy comes and testifies against her and tells the story about how he took her out in the back alley and everything else, and he is a witness, and he is actually the guy, in a way, who is and more of a criminal than she is. This is the universal truth. It happens everywhere in the world. I mean, child prostitution, selling children into women into prostitution, the slave trade, all this stuff. I mean, this is a powerful universal story, and it takes place within the framework of the Canadian context. But the more I worked on it, I realized, wow, this is George had a very, very big picture, and it manifests itself in here. So I'm quite prepared to defend myself. Also, Larry and I went in Winnipeg. We started to do a lot of spade work in Manitoba community, because in Toronto it's very hard to do because there's so many First Nations people from so many different places in Canada. There's no homogeneous body you can go to. My first contact there was Isidore Day, who was the regional chief, and he said, I met him actually, the RWB did a big ballet called Coming Home Star, about, it was based on residential schools. And the one of the headers, fellow students at Ryerson, Billy Maasti, who's a brilliant, brilliant actor, was in it. No, he was in the audience. No, he was in the audience. He was in oh, sorry, tighten it. Sorry.
I just want to get.
Okay. Yes, I have so many thoughts about it. Maybe I should just stop.
You were on a good roll. I just
Okay.
will
I have?
Over tea tonight.
Will it be about appropriation? Larry and I visited many people in the Indigenous community. The Grand Chief, Nepanak, explained to him what the thing was. He said, "This sounds like the community can support." A representative of the murdered women, yes, we want to hear this story. A whole bunch of people we visited and explained what we're going to do, and they are all on side for the story to be heard.
I do want to open it up to everybody right now, and I'm wondering if we have this festival's writer-in-residence here, Patricia Keeney, and you were talking about your African connections on this. Pat has just written a novel about an African theater company working under the period of Idi Amin. It's a true story, and it's a story about a black African man, and Pat is not a black African man, and the question of appropriation of voice has come up around the book, and Pat actually starts out the novel talking about who is she to write this book. Pat, would you be willing to say something about this question of appropriation of voice as we start to open it up to everybody else?
Yes, of course. But I would also like to spend a couple of minutes just talking about my first impressions of Rita Joe. I saw the original production at the Ottawa National Gallery.
The National, that's it.
Yes, all those years ago.
Yeah.
And it wasn't my first time in the theater, but it was absolutely one of my most transforming times in the theater. And it was the combination of those, those extraordinary issues in such a sophisticated and complex art form. I mean, both Anne and Don have talked about that art form, and it was a consummate art form. And it was the impact of what was being said in the way it was being said that was so powerful. And I came away thinking, I don't think I thought it then because I didn't know enough, but this is Canada's Ibsen, this is Canada's Chekhov, this is the beginning of relevant theater in this country. And then for some years later, I've taught Rita Joe in my university classes. Remembering that first production, I never saw another production, but remembering those moments of pure poetry and music and blended art forms within the production. those moments of David George and isn't it the butterfly?
Yeah.
I mean,
Dragonfly.
Dragonfly.
Dragonfly,
That's
yeah.
right, extraordinary poetry. Those fiery moments, Jamie Paul, give me back my truth, you know, when he's rooting around in the clothes, the cast-offs that they're supposed to take up. Rita Joy, and this is especially relevant to students. I mean, in our multicultural age and in my multicultural classes, students come from all sorts of other countries and cultures. And they're listening to Rita Joe all those years ago, sitting in a classroom uncomfortably, listening to lines from Wordsworth. She has no idea what they are about. And there is no relationship for her, you know, to her own culture. So those kinds of moments, the students and I, and they just worked every time. And this is up until right now. I mean, I'm still teaching Rita Joe, and it is still being taught everywhere. Now, the whole question, as Don pointed out, of appropriation of voice, and I absolutely agree, we cannot be who we are as artists, writers, and human beings without appropriating, without attempting to understand and include and respond to other. Without that, we're isolated in our own little, you know, cells, and what's the point of that? What's the point of us all being here? But it comes up especially for me, as Don pointed out, with this book, One Man Dancing. I'll be talking more about it when I do my reading. But it's something that it's a very sensitive issue. I'm sure you've heard something about the Writers' Union of Canada and this kerfuffle around the latest edition of their magazine called Write, which is dedicated to Indigenous writing, but which has an introduction by the editor, Hal, wonderfully Polish name, where did it go? Niedzwiecki, I think. You know, and he was roundly opposed for what he said, and the essence of what he says is, I don't believe in cultural appropriation. In my opinion, anyone, anywhere should be encouraged to imagine other peoples, other cultures, other identities. And I think what we're talking about is the empathy one needs as writers and artists and people to do what we do and be who we are and bridge that gap.
And he was fired for saying that.
Oh, yes, he was fired from the magazine.
Oh, my.
He was shut up.
My.
He was, you know, and the Writers' Union, of course, got behind it and said, oh, of course, he was all wrong. You know. And it's interesting, Drew Hayden Taylor, well,
That's censorship.
Journalists responded, arts journalists, but I found Drew Hayden Taylor's response was extremely harsh.
He's a First Nations writer
Yes,
himself.
sorry. Yes, you don't know. But one of the things he says at the end of this piece is, for Native people, art and culture are not separate. The art of the West Coast carver is inseparable from their heritage, some with Inuit sculpture and Cree beading. Anything that infringes upon our art can be considered a direct threat to our culture, so understandably, Indigenous people react. I mean, Anne, you were talking earlier about sacred songs, and yes, that's understood, but there's got to be a somewhat indefinite line and a sliding scale between what we all call art and what we all call culture, and what we all call not necessarily religion, but a spiritual being, you know, that we all have. And art is part of that for all of us, I suggest, you know. Historically, perhaps more so for Indigenous peoples, and certainly in the West, if you go back to the Greeks, it was religion to begin with as well, you know, with the Greek classics. So, I mean, I throw that out. As I started thinking about these things, and there were two other examples, I won't go into them in detail. I think you may all know about the Joseph Boyden controversy going on right now. There's a wonderful article in this past issue of Maclean's in which he attempts to, I think it's a noble defense, it is a defense, because this is a writer, I think he's a fine, fine writer and has written what no one else can. I mean, we all write what, as you say, and from our deepest depths, what we need to write. His pedigree, shall we say, is Scots, Irish, and Métis, and I can't remember exactly what the proportion is of Métis, but on one side, his father is European, and his mother comes from indigenous background, indigenous people. Joseph has worked for many, many years with individual cultural groups in the schools, doing funding. He has been officially adopted by several different groups, and it's gone on for years and years and years. And I think that the accusation against him is not so much one of cultural appropriation for what he has written, although some stories are in question, you know, in later works. It's rather that now he speaks out on behalf of certain groups of his people, and other indigenous voices are coming along and saying, you have no right to speak out, we must speak for ourselves. Yes, you must speak for yourselves, but why does not he have the right as well? He is part of your family, he has been adopted by you. And the whole article is really a plea to understand that it's not just blood, it's culture, it's belonging, who you belong to and who belongs to you, who you care about and who cares for you, and what you share and what you give and share. So, I mean, I think that's a huge and difficult one there, and that's going to go on for a while. Another just small example I have, I don't know if you know the Canadian writer Gary Geddes, well known as a poet and a social, not so much activist, but certainly a writer who deals with social issues in prose as well. One of his last books, actually it's just published now, Medicine Unbundled, in which he examines the Canadian healthcare system vis-a-vis Indigenous peoples and the terrible gaps there are and inadequacies there are within that system. I was given a book of his to review, which I did, called The Resumption of Play. Now, the resumption of play, you may know the term, is something that the priest called out the window to the boys in the residential schools during a recess or whatever it was, after the priest had done whatever he was doing with the one boy he had called in. Now, that's finished. Resumption of play. This is the title of a key poem in the book, and it chronicles in what really powerful poetry the life of the boy, one boy who was taken and goes through his life and the various phases of his life. This was just before all of this other stuff came out. In reviewing the book, I talked about how Geddes used voices. I'm saying, you know, this is a book of voices. In other words, the voices sound and feel authentic, the voice of this particular man. So I was actually talking about poetic persona, you know?
Mm-hmm.
This is a poetic technique. So the editors come back and say, wait a minute, and I have reviewed for our, you know, a long time. We all know each other. What right is he to speak with this voice, with these voices? And so I realized, oh, I've stepped on a landmine here, and so has Gary, and Gary probably doesn't. Now, Gary has in other prose pieces talked about his hesitation, his worry about ethics, the permission that he has, and in every case, he has made extraordinary efforts to gain proper permission. People have wanted to talk to him. People have given freely of their time and very difficult stories to him. The other book he does is I've lost the title for a moment, but one in which he explores truth and justice in Africa, visiting countries such as Uganda, Rwanda, Somalia, and so forth. And it's the same situation there. What all of this started me thinking was, wait a minute, there is the other side to this rather narrow definition of appropriation of voice, which is donation of voice, for want of a better word. And I think Don, at the end of his intro, used the word enabling. There are situations in which the voices that need to be heard cannot be heard.
Mm-hmm.
And so if a writer or an artist comes along and says, and feels, this thing, and wants to write it, and wants to sing it, and wants to play it, there has to be that allowance. So, and I've presented this idea to the CBC for one. Let's look at donation of voice. Let's look at those instances and areas where donation of voice has been the only way in which these voices have been heard. So I just, I throw that out as a...
Yeah. Thank you. I wonder, on the question here of donation or appropriation of voice, Tanya, I wonder if I could call on you as somebody who's been around a lot of this stuff. I was shocked to hear from Peter about a note you sent saying that 3 productions of Rita Joe had been canceled this coming year, last year, for what universities or theater companies felt was appropriation of voice. And I was shocked by that and hurt by that, and I can only imagine that you were shocked and hurt by that as well. Can you say a little about that and how they said this to you and what your reaction was?
First of all, Don, I'd like to thank the panelists for the depth and passion that you're attacking these lovely subjects and the big bites out of the elephant of appropriation. And as I look around the room and I see the homogenized faces here, it's probably, my son's voice is in my head, it's not up to us to decide if it's appropriation. The dominant culture, step the fuck aside. And that's a Ryga grandson for you. And so then pragmatically, because I look after my father's works, the show's not, it's not being done, bottom line. So some do not say, York did not say it's because of appropriation. They just said, we've made other plans for our season next year. Company in Victoria never answered, right? Contracts out there, no response, no response, no response. I'm hoping. There was a high school in northern Saskatchewan. It was kind of lovely. It was a mostly First Nations population in this high school, and they wanted to take the play, they wanted to take the PG parts of Rita Joe and kind of make a bread and enter it in their one-act festival.
PG is, PG.
Parental guidance. Clean. Clean for high school. And
Victor had pregnant on that.
PG, oh yeah.
And that request was denied.
Yeah.
Oh.
Yeah.
That's
Yeah.
not doing justice to the play. They're just taking the squeaky clean parts. And the one that hurts is that's closest to home is my own college. I teach in a theater program at Red Deer College. And Rita Joe, and I did not push for this. This was a surprise that they wanted to do it in honor of its birthday, etc. And then asked around, looking for Indigenous directors. My request is that they find an Indigenous director. That was tough. People were distancing themselves from that. And there were a couple of letters that strongly suggested that that department do not put on that show. That because the cast would be primarily white, and other, if there were Indigenous possible theater students that wanted to maybe come to this college that would see white people putting on The Ecstasy of Rita Joe might feel discouraged in coming. The argument does not hold weight. It's not a good argument. But the bottom line is appropriation, yes, no, what do we think about it? How does it affect us art-wise? Bottom line is the show's not being done. And I don't know when, maybe as an opera, clearly it is. There's an anthology coming out from the University of Regina, all about anything to do with the Ecstasy of Rita Joe, so in print form. But I don't know when there will be a stage production of that show. Because of our climate now, yeah. And whether or not, whether it's right or wrong, if it's time for us to step aside.
Yeah, it's a very important question. It's one that is in the air and needs to be talked about. Is it appropriation of voice? Is it donation of voice? Do we speak for each other? Do we have the right as artists? Do artists have the right to speak on any subject of deep concern to them? I think about this, when I think about this, I had contact recently with a very good director, an actor friend of mine in Ethiopia. He's one of Ethiopia's leading actors and directors, the artistic director of the National Theatre of Addis Ababa, and he said their biggest hit last year was a production of The Merchant of Venice, which he starred in as Shylock. Now, if we wanted to go and look the other way and say appropriation of voice, how can you have all those black people playing Jews and Venetians and this and that? That's unacceptable. I don't know, at what point are we all human? At what point do we all need the freedom to speak about things that bother us, things that concern us? And that's something that George Ryga's work has always done. George spoke about the things that bothered him, and he spoke about it with an honesty and an integrity that is rare, that broke theatrical molds. That's what we're dealing with. That's what people are saying. I'm a little nervous about this. I'm a little concerned about this. Well, a good production, I believe, would change a lot of those concerns. I don't know how to answer that, but let me open it up to the rest of you. George Ryga, Ryga Festival, The Ecstasy of Rita Joe, appropriation of voice. Anybody want to add anything to any of those subjects, please?
Yeah, I'm really interested in this appropriation of voice thing. Because I can't speak as a First Nations person, but I can certainly speak to as a woman. And for the whole time that we grew up, I think looking at the ages in the room, when you look at what we read in high school, we read Lord of the Flies and Heart of Darkness, men. And I remember as a teenager not being able to understand how I as a female fit into the world. Now we now have a plethora of female writers. Some we love, some I'm like, okay, more chick lit, I can't stand that, but it's there, right? And so I think what's happened is women have found their voices, not perhaps equitably, but in a much better way. And so we are able to relax a little bit about that. I've just moved here from a place where there were 5 First Nations groups, and there was probably 30% First Nations population in the town I was in, 5 different nations, and was part of a First Nations theater company, etc. And we had that discussion all the time. And one of the things that I realized is when you feel weak, you just explode with anger, and everything's wrong. And so if you're a feminist, and for a long time feminists were this one homogenous thing, and then feminists of color got mad at white feminists, and everything blew apart. But that's because there was people were feeling weak. And as you find your voice, and as you become stronger, I think you are more lenient. It does bother me that people of the dominant culture say, oh, that's appropriation. Because I think that I could very easily write a novel with a white male protagonist because I grew up with it. And that was what I learned. I think it'd be much harder for me to write a novel of a First Nation protagonist because I don't have that background. And I talk lots, so I'll stop.
I keep coming back to the very word appropriation, which is to take something away. And I think what you're saying is really significant, that looking at these works, was Ryga taking something? I don't think so. I think what you're talking about, empowering voices that weren't being heard, and that in many cases still aren't being heard. But where is it a gift to donate your voice versus taking something away? And perhaps that word isn't even applicable, because I think in the context in which he was writing, to suggest that he was taking that voice away from other writers, it doesn't even seem like a relevant conversation. Now, what you were talking about in terms of Red Deer and putting on a production, I don't know, on a really simple level, could there have been other Native students at the college who could have performed? Because I know that is a community in which there are very many First Nations, and it would be odd for me as a theater goer to go and see a production that was predominantly white and not having those roles filled by First Nations people. But that's sort of, I don't know, a simplistic thing. Yeah, how do you make it relevant now? But yeah, just the idea of appropriation being taking away of something, and yet what we've been talking about very often is a gift of voice.
But I think your point is really well taken, that
Sorry, go ahead.
that until strength is felt, it can't be regarded as donation, you know. And I think strength has to come through political action. I mean, I think Trudeau's initiative with the department is a really positive step there, but all sorts of things have to happen before that strength is in place. And so, you know, equality is not, it's certainly not just up to artists and writers. I think the whole world has to change appreciably in terms of the level of living.
That donation thing is brilliant, though. That's a brilliant thing. It's something I've never thought of before. I have to.
Well, you know, and it just came from, because I spent 2 years interviewing the person about whom I wrote. And there's a long story behind it and leading up to it, but I will just say that there had been many attempts by others to tell his story. He had been satisfied with none of them. And he could not tell his story because he is in some ways unable and disabled. And when we got together, and I was doing a lot of listening, your listening is really important, it's what I did, to catch his voice, to catch the quality of his life, to understand as much as I could what he had been experiencing. And I mean, it's some of it is horrendous and much of it is crazy and exciting and nuts. And he's a black African man. So there's an imaginative trip that you have to take as a writer and an artist, and that's what we try to do. That's what we try to train ourselves to do. So, you know.
Yeah,
Yeah, I was just going to say, I really very much agree with what you were talking about. I think that it is a matter of how close you are to an experience of healing. And I know that in the musical I've just finished, we did a showcase of it in June. And it was the myth of Demeter and Persephone, where Persephone is raped by Hades and held prisoner. And then at the end, and the myth doesn't tell you, but at the end, she becomes the queen of the underworld. So we'd ask people to write about this. And and how did the story work for you, et cetera, et cetera. In general, people loved the show, and most of them said, it was very powerful, the way the healing took place, and this, that, and the other. But there was a small number of women who were outraged that, not knowing the myth, that Persephone stayed in the underworld with her abductor. And one woman actually wrote to me and said, forgiveness is not enough. You need to call me. This is not appropriate that she stayed with her abductor in the underworld. That story just says rape is okay.
Wow.
And I knew she was halfway through her own healing. So I did call her, and she was just starting her journey of healing. And and most of the women that I ended up talking with who hated the ending of the play were women just halfway or a quarter of way into their healing. And those women I talked to who had gone through rape and had been in the restorative justice section of the world, they had healed. And they had realized that their abductor, their rapist, was as much a victim as they were. And in the sense of their own trauma that had caused them to move in that direction. So I think that point of, at this time in our culture, when the healing is very raw, but at the time Rita Jo was born, it wasn't even in the white conversation.
Yeah.
It was a truth that needed to be spoken.
It was a truth that, and it wouldn't have been heard
No.
had it been spoken by an Aboriginal
That's
person.
right. I'm completely in agreement with
Yeah.
that.
So I think right now we may see this pulling back because we have to make space for the other voices to come forward and tell us their story.
Yes, please.
Except.
Sorry, there.
Well, I might be interrupting something that I'm so thoroughly enjoying, but I did want to say I'm not a playwright. I'm a consumer, a groupie. That's me. You need me, right?
A cultural groupie,
But
that's good.
My best experience, and one of the many, but this was an outstanding experience when I first moved to Vancouver. I went to George Ryga's play, and I realized I was a character in the play because I took cookies through the United Church down to the Indian Friendship Center, which doesn't happen to have been invented. It was an absolutely stupefying learning curve because I was a young adult at that point. I mean, I think I was at that time. And I grew up in Nova Scotia with both Indigenous people who were called Indians and Black people who were called Black. But as I matured from a child, I realized that we're really all one. We just have a different colored skin and a different background. Mine's Scottish and yours is something else, and that's what we all have. So I thought that George Ryga was stunning. Then I met Eva Cleland, whom some of you may have a memory of. And she was a part of a group of people, mostly women, who wanted to have a program produced called OMRAC. It was going to be an assimilation of the arts in the Okanagan by all the towns. And it was an Okanagan mainline regional arts production. And so we were sitting in the living room talking, and Eva Cleland said, well, why don't we just call George and ask him if he'll write a play? So he actually was just, I mean, I didn't know at all. It was just a phone in the kitchen, and George Ryga answered the phone. And I'm listening to Eva saying, what do you say? And she said, you know, just ask him. So I asked him if he would be interested in writing a play for our great production we were going to have, which would feature operas, this world we were going to do to show how great the Okanagan is. But the Okanagan didn't quite realize it just yet. So the end of this story is simply that George Ryga said he'd be happy to do so, and he began the story which we will hear this afternoon, read by a whole nother second generation of young people. So I thank you all for being here for me.
That's good.
I came with an artist, okay?
That's great. Don?
Yeah, a lot of what I've been hearing today, well, let me just explain first that I've had the great joy in my adult life of living with, playing with, working with people, artists, largely performing artists. And what I've been hearing today around these topics of appropriation, et cetera, really, really troubles me, because my friends and colleagues who are artists and are highly, highly sensitive and sensitized to how we live as human beings on this earth, are feeling that they have to be careful. And if there's anything that artists are true to themselves and highly imaginative. And if those two qualities are somehow stunted, regardless of race, doesn't matter, it's depriving us of their full and true voices. That's one thing. The other thing is, being of my generation here in this country, having been married to someone of another race, having a son who has blended those two, and now have children of 4 races, what are we talking about when we're talking about my voice and your voice and how authentic I am or you are? So I think we are living in very interesting times, as they say in the Chinese.
Exactly.
And it is a time that we're moving through. I think also the word enabling makes better sense to me than you've taken my voice or help me speak my voice makes a lot more sense to me, whatever that voice is. And appropriation is not something that I think should figure in our language so much as authenticity. And the authenticity is to oneself, as you were saying. So whoever you are, whatever you have to say, is worthy of being heard if you're really speaking through whatever influences you have had in your life and bringing it out yourself. Not, how do you say that? How can I say that just like you say that?
Yeah.
But, I hear what you say, and this is what I'd like to say about it. That makes much more sense to me, because I think my dear friends like Victor, who's been laboring with Rita Jo for years now and trying to be respectful, careful, really, really concerns me in the kind of larger scheme of things. That's what I'm saying.
One of George's old friends, and I use the word old advisedly here, Dick Clement. Dick, can you share a little bit with us about George and his relationship with other communities here?
I didn't meet George Ryga until he was 22. I was 27. But I want to bow in this room to another presence, his sister Anne, who outclasses me altogether in terms of the length of time of knowing George. And I met Anne in Edmonton, a part of a group of folk singers that George organized called the Tamarack. I just think back to, we started being rebels. We got one of those application forms and we said human and we wrote down race. Pardon me, we said race and we wrote down human. Said sex and we put 3 times a week. We're not.
So politically correct right from the beginning.
Appropriation in that first production in 19... by the way, I drove George to Vancouver from here with the original draft of that play. I named in it as one of the tribunal that had to go, and we got a single magistrate. But there was some ruffling among the cast when Francis Hyam was going to play Rita Joe. And one day, after all this had been going on for a while, Chief Dan George said, "You're doing fine, Fanny Joe." And we need to think about that, I think. The story about the butterfly or the dragonfly was actually a story about a butterfly. That was in the living room there, up at the house. The Kayunzik family were there, and a friend of theirs who had spent the winter with an indigenous group in Mexico to learn a certain technique in rug weaving or rug hooking, and it was his story. Now he sat by the lake and watched this caterpillar crawl up on the log and pupate. And a moment I saw George, there would be us sitting in a thing like this, and he'd be back there by the door, and he disappeared, and then you hear the typewriter and you get the story about the dragonfly in conversation with Jamie Paul.
Yeah.
So I don't know. I'm also a plowboy. 1949 and 1950, I was able to work on tractor crews with members of the Ermineskin Cree people from the Opium Reserve, and we were human beings together. We washed our hands in the same basin, we ate the same food, we sat by the table. Thank you.
Thank you, Dick.
Yeah.
Let me just remind people here what Chief Dan George said himself about the ecstasy of Rita Joe.
Mm-hmm.
And this is in the published edition of the play. He says, "The ecstasy of Rita Joe carries a message all Canada should hear. It is a message Canada needs to hear. I was amazed at the reaction the play received in Ottawa. People came to us to say that now, for the first time, they understood a little of what the Native peoples have suffered and are suffering. The Indian people at this very time need to put their message before Canada because laws are being readied that will affect the Indian for years to come. They need, above all, to create sympathy and understanding, for they are depressed economically. It is useless for people to hear if they do not listen with their hearts. Rita Joe helps them to listen with their hearts. And when hearts are open, ears can hear. The message is true. It should be heard by all." That's Chief Dan George speaking about this. Let me end with George's own words, not on Rita Joe, but something he wrote for me in 1985 when the World Congress of the International Theatre Institute of UNESCO was coming to Canada for the first time. And there were people from something like 85 nations, theater people, government people, artists, coming to Montreal and Toronto for 10 days to experience Canada, to debate the responsibilities of the artists, the social role of the artists. And I was on the board of directors of that planning group, and there was unanimity that we wanted George Ryga to write the opening statement for that Congress. And George did. And I would just like to read to you the end of his statement to the world about theater and about Canada and about life. He said, "To endure, to bring about the best moments in human destiny, despite the twin senses of expediency or the fashions of the marketplace, is all important. To endure. We in Canada have some running experience of what it means to endure in theater. Theater is the revelation of human character in extreme situations. Understanding this, we understand the foundations of others' origins shaped into understandable metaphors by the building blocks of language and the poetry of ritual. To be born is a ritual. To live with grace and dignity, even in great poverty, is a ritual of hope. And yes, people die for these privileges, even as these words are being considered and written. Such is the pulse of Canada. Such is the pulse of our hemisphere, a revolutionary pulse beat in which we all move, knowingly or unknowingly." I think this has been a really interesting discussion. We've talked about this difficult issue of appropriation of voice. It's not just blood, but it's culture and who you care about. The artist is someone who dreams deeply, said Anne. We are all appropriating from one another all the time. We need to speak for one another. George Ryga would be for all of those ideas, and a festival in George Ryga's name here in George Ryga's beloved Summerland would be such a wonderful idea. I hope it happens. I think money will be found if you really want to make it happen. I think Summerland would be a great place for a festival. And I would like to give the last word on this before we end to the person who pushed for this seminar all along for some final comments. Peter Hahn.
Thank you so much, Don, and thank you again for coming. I want to again stress that Don, every panelist here came on their own expense here, and that is a tribute, I think, to what we feel about George. It really is, he had this magic of connecting with people of all kinds. It didn't matter who we were. I was from Hungary and Switzerland and England, and we spoke the same language. So that is the quality that we're honoring in this festival. And I was tremendously moved by this discussion. It brought him back. And thank you for that.
Thank you, Peter.
Thank you, Peter.